Laughter echoed across the dusty gravel of the auction yard when Clara raised her paddle for a rusted, hollowed-out 1978 Ford 7000. It had no engine, no transmission, and 4 dry-rotted tires. The local farmers sneered, whispering that a desperate woman had finally lost her mind to the crushing weight of farm debt. They saw 1,000 pounds of useless scrap metal, but Clara didn't see scrap. She saw a vessel, what she was about to drag into her locked barn, and the shocking secret she was preparing to drop beneath that faded blue hood would soon bring the entire county to its knees and change the future of modern agriculture forever. $74,000. That was the number burning a hole in Clara Harrison's mind as she stood in the suffocating July heat of Oak Haven, Iowa. It wasn't money she had, it was the exact amount she owed to First Continental Bank by the end of October. If she missed that payment, the 400-acre farm her family had worked for 3 generations would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The bank's regional manager, Richard Sterling, had already made his intentions clear. He didn't want Clara to succeed. He wanted her prime, nutrient-rich topsoil to sell to a corporate agriculture conglomerate expanding into the Midwest. For 2 years, Clara and her husband, Greg, had fought a losing battle against drought, skyrocketing diesel prices, and devastating repair bills on their aging machinery. When their primary workhorse, a massive, 20-year-old John Deere 8400 threw a rod and cracked its engine block 3 days before the crucial summer tilling, the Harrison farm was effectively paralyzed. They needed a tractor, a big one, but their bank account held exactly $1,452, which brought Clara to the Tri-County Equipment Liquidation Auction. It was a graveyard of broken dreams where bankrupt farmers watched their livelihoods sold off piecemeal. The air smelled of stale beer, chewing tobacco, and hot grease. Clara stood near the back of the crowd, her faded denim jacket pulled tight despite the heat, her eyes scanning the rows of gleaming, expensive machinery she could never afford. "Looking to buy a miracle today, Clara?" A voice sneered from her left. It was Bill Henderson, a local corporate farm manager who had been circling her land like a vulture for months. Bill was a loud, imposing man who wore a spotless Stetson and drove a brand-new Platinum Edition Ford F250 that had never seen a day of actual mud. "Just browsing, Bill?" Clara kept her voice neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. "Better browse fast. Sterling tells me your time's about up. We'd be willing to take that north pasture off your hands right now. Save you the embarrassment of a foreclosure," Bill said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Clara turned her back to him, focusing on the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Dale Farnham, who was currently taking bids on a pristine Case Win H. Steiger. It sold for $180,000. The numbers flying through the air felt like a foreign language to her. She watched in despair as tractor after tractor rolled across the block, each one fetching prices that could have paid off her entire mortgage. Then, toward the end of the day, as the crowd began to thin and the auctioneers moved to the salvage and scrap section, a rusted hulk was dragged forward by a heavy chain attached to a skid steer. It was a 1978 Ford 7000, or at least the ghost of one. The iconic blue paint was entirely rusted through, leaving an ugly, bruised brown patina. The cab glass was shattered, but worst of all, the hood was propped open, revealing a gaping, empty chasm where the massive diesel engine used to sit. The transmission was gone. The PTO, power takeoff shaft, was missing. It was literally just a rolling steel chassis, a steering wheel, and a heavy cast-iron frame. "All right, folks, lot 142, Dale's voice crackled over the worn PA system, suddenly lacking the energetic rhythm he used for the expensive gear. "Got a rolling chassis here, heavy iron. Good for parts or scrap weight. Let's start the bidding at $500. Silence. Even the scrap metal dealers were hesitant. Dragging that much dead weight onto a flatbed barely justified the fuel cost to transport it to the smelter. "500? Come on now, there's good steel here. Give me 300. 200? Dale pleaded, wiping sweat from his forehead. Bill Henderson laughed loudly, leaning against a nearby fence. "Dale, you'd have to pay me to haul that garbage away. Put it out of its misery." The crowd chuckled. Clara stared at the empty engine bay. Her mind wasn't in Oakhaven anymore. It was flashing back to a dusty, padlocked shed behind her late grandfather's house. A man who had been a mechanical engineer for a secret aerospace defense contractor before retiring to a quiet life of farming. She remembered a heavily tarped object, a notebook filled with frantic, brilliant calculations, and a deathbed promise she had made to never let his life's work fall into the wrong hands. She looked at the heavy, reinforced steel frame of the Ford. It was built in an era when tractors were made of solid, unbreakable iron. It was the perfect, indestructible shell. $100, Dale sighed. Do I hear 100? Clara's hand shot up. Her worn bidding paddle, number 84, cut through the humid air. The entire auction yard went dead silent. Dozens of heads snapped around to look at her. Bill Henderson's jaw dropped, and then he burst into genuine belly-shaking laughter. Well, I'll be damned. Clara Harrison just bought herself a lawn ornament. Gonna pull it yourself, Clara. Hook yourself up to a yoke like an ox? Mocking laughter rippled through the remaining crowd. Farmers shook their heads in pity. A few whispered that the stress had finally broken her. Buying an engineless tractor when her farm was 3 months from foreclosure was the ultimate act of a desperate, delusional mind. Sold to bidder 84 for $100, Dale said, striking his gavel with a dull thud. He looked at Clara with a mixture of confusion and genuine pity. You have a way to haul this off the lot, Mrs. Harrison? I'll have a flatbed here in an hour, Clara said, her voice steady, ignoring the burning stares of her neighbors. She walked to the payment tent, handed over a crisp $100 bill from her meager stash, and collected her paperwork. As she walked back to her rusted farm truck, Bill stepped into her path. You really are crazy, he sneered, shaking his head. I'll tell Sterling to draw up the foreclosure papers now. You're done, Clara. Watch me, Bill, Clara said softly, her eyes cold and hard. You just watch me. The sun was sinking below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the Harrison farm as the hired tow truck unceremoniously dumped the hollowed-out Ford 7000 in front of the main barn. The heavy iron chassis hit the dirt with a loud, hollow thud that echoed across the empty fields. Greg walked out of the farmhouse, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face had been prematurely aged by years of relentless financial stress. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the rusted hulk, and then looked at his wife. Clara, Greg started, his voice thick with exhaustion. Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you bought this for scrap to sell to the yard in Des Moines. I bought it for us, Clara said, walking around the tractor, running her hand along the cold, rusted steel of the heavy front axle. It's perfect, Greg. Look at the frame clearance. Look at the weight distribution. It's exactly what we need. Greg dropped the rag. It doesn't have an engine, Clara. It's an empty metal box. We have no tractor. We have 70 grand in debt, and you bought a paperweight. Come with me, Clara said, grabbing his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. There's something I need to show you, something I've never shown anyone. She led him past the main house, out toward the back acreage where the old original homestead structures still stood. Tucked behind a grove of dying oak trees was a dilapidated cinder-block outbuilding that her grandfather, Thomas Miller, had built in the late 1980s. Thomas had been an eccentric man. Before he returned to Iowa to farm, he had spent 30 years working for a classified division of Lockheed, developing experimental power and propulsion systems. When he moved back, he spent his nights locked in this outbuilding. He passed away 5 years ago, leaving the building padlocked. Clara was the only one with the key. She pulled a heavy brass key from her pocket and broke the seal of rust on the padlock. With a heavy shove, the heavy steel door creaked open. The air inside smelled of ozone, old paper, and machine oil. Greg stepped inside, coughing as the dust settled. He reached for the pull chain of a single overhead bulb. When the light flickered on, his eyes widened. The room wasn't a storage shed. It was a high-tech laboratory hidden in a barn. There were oscilloscopes, heavy-duty welding rigs, and massive bundles of heavy-gauge copper wiring. But the centerpiece of the room, sitting on a reinforced concrete pedestal, was an object covered by a thick, dust-caked canvas tarp. Clara walked over to the tarp and grabbed the corner. Grandpa Thomas didn't just tinker out here, Greg. He was terrified of what was happening to the world's energy dependency. He saw how volatile diesel and oil prices were going to become. He knew it would eventually kill the independent farmer. She yanked the tarp back. Beneath it sat something that looked completely alien to a Midwestern farm. It was a massive, cylindrical construct of gleaming titanium and brushed aluminum, roughly the size of a standard diesel engine block, but devoid of any pistons, exhaust manifolds, or traditional fuel injectors. It was wrapped in thick, insulated magnetic coils and featured a series of high-pressure intake valves. "What in God's name is that?" Greg whispered, stepping closer, completely mesmerized by the pristine machinery. "He called it the MTEG," Clara explained, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Methane thermal electric generator. But it's not just a generator. It's a closed-loop kinetic hybrid power plant. He repurposed aerospace turbine technology and combined it with an electromagnetic, continuously variable transmission." Greg looked at her, completely lost. "Clara, speak English." Clara took a deep breath. "It runs on raw, unrefined biogas, Greg. Methane. The exact same methane we vent into the atmosphere every single day from our dairy cow manure pits. The system takes the raw gas, ignites it in a micro-turbine which spins a suspended kinetic flywheel at 70,000 RPMs. That kinetic energy is converted into massive amounts of electrical torque." She walked over to a workbench and unrolled a massive blueprint. "It produces the equivalent of 600 horsepower. It doesn't need diesel. It doesn't need a transmission with gears that can strip. It generates pure, instantaneous electric torque to the wheels, powered entirely by the waste our farm already produces." Greg stared at the blueprints, his hands trembling slightly. If this is real, why didn't he ever use it? Why did he hide it? "Because it was dangerous," Clara said softly. "Not the machine itself, but the disruption it would cause. He knew that if the major agricultural conglomerates and the fossil fuel industry found out he had built a zero-cost, infinite-torque farm engine that bypassed their entire economic ecosystem, they would bury him or steal it. He made me promise to only use it when I had absolutely no other choice." She rolled the blueprint back up and looked her husband in the eye. "We have no other choice, Greg. Sterling is coming for our land. Henderson is waiting to bulldoze our home. We are out of time and out of options." Greg looked from his wife to the gleaming aerospace cylinder, and then back toward the open door in the direction of the rusted Ford 7000 sitting in the yard. He slowly realized what she was proposing. "You bought that Ford?" Greg started, the pieces finally snapping together in his mind. "Because it has the strongest cast-iron chassis ever built," Clara finished. "It's a hollow vault. It's exactly what I need to mount the MTEG. The neighbors think I bought a piece of scrap. They think I'm a joke. Let them laugh, Greg. Let them think we've gone crazy. We're going to put this engine inside that tractor, and we are going to save this farm." Greg stood in silence for a long moment. He looked at the mountain of debt they were buried under. He looked at the fierce, unyielding determination burning in his wife's eyes. A slow, determined smile finally broke across his exhausted face. "All right," Greg said, rolling up his sleeves. "Where do we start?" The operation had to be completely clandestine. If Bill Henderson or Richard Sterling caught wind that the Harrisons were building something highly experimental, they would immediately notify county code enforcement to shut them down under the guise of environmental hazard or unregulated heavy machinery construction. The local inspector, a perpetually sweaty man named Greg Hauser, was heavily in the pocket of the bank. One anonymous tip, and the farm would be swarming with county deputies placing red tags on everything they owned. For the next 3 weeks, the Harrison farm became a fortress. Clara and Greg worked from sunset to sunrise, keeping the barn doors padlocked and the windows blacked out with heavy tarps. During the day, they maintained the illusion of defeat, doing manual labor in the fields with shovels and wheelbarrows, playing the part of the broken, bankrupt farmers. The physical toll was agonizing. Moving a 1,200-pound prototype aerospace engine from the outbuilding to the main barn required building a custom gantry crane out of old scaffolding. When they finally lowered the MTEG into the rusted, gaping chassis of the Ford 7000, it was a perfect, terrifying fit. The titanium cylinder sat nestled between the heavy iron rails like a futuristic heart, waiting to be shocked to life. But marrying 1970s agricultural iron with 1980s classified aerospace tech was a nightmare of engineering. Clara spent her nights covered in grease and burn marks, welding custom motor mounts, splicing heavy voltage cables, and calibrating the digital control modules her grandfather had painstakingly built from scratch. To hide the high-tech interior, Clara took the rusted side panels of the Ford's hood and reattached them, welding them permanently shut. From the outside, it still looked like a beat-up, dead tractor, but beneath the rusted exterior was a labyrinth of high-pressure, braided steel hoses feeding into the turbine, and thick, anaconda-sized copper cables routing power to the heavy-duty electric drive motors she had secretly salvaged from a wrecked commercial mining truck in the next county. The hardest part was the fuel system. They couldn't just pull up to a gas station. They had to build a makeshift methane capture dome over their farm's manure lagoon. Under the cover of darkness, Greg laid hundreds of feet of PVC piping, burying it a few inches under the soil, routing the captured biogas directly into a heavy-duty compressor hidden behind the barn. The secrecy, however, was beginning to slip. On a muggy Tuesday morning, Clara was inside the barn, her welding mask down, showering the dark room in a cascade of blue sparks as she finalized the linkage between the electric motors and the Ford's rear differential. The deafening hiss of the TIG welder drowned out the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. Suddenly, a heavy fist pounded on the metal barn door. "Harrison, open up!" Clara froze. She killed the welder, plunging the barn into silence. She could hear heavy breathing outside the door. "I know you're in there, Clara. Open this door before I call the sheriff." It was Bill Henderson. Clara scrambled, grabbing a heavy canvas tarp and throwing it over the rear axle where the electric motors were clearly visible. She wiped the grease from her face, took a deep breath, and unlatched the heavy sliding door, cracking it open just enough to step outside and block his view. Bill stood there, flanked by Inspector Hauser. Hauser was holding a clipboard, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "What do you want, Bill?" Clara demanded, crossing her arms. "You're trespassing." "We got a report," Inspector Hauser stammered, adjusting his glasses. An anonymous report, Mrs. Harrison. Someone claims you're operating unregulated, potentially hazardous welding and mechanical construction on the premises without the proper industrial permits." "Anonymous?" Clara scoffed, glaring at Bill. "I'm fixing a tractor, Hauser. Since when does a farmer need an industrial permit to turn a wrench on her own property?" "When she's running industrial arc welders at 3 a.m. and building God knows what," Bill sneered, trying to peek around Clara into the dark barn. "Word in town is you're going crazy, Clara, building some kind of junk monster. Sterling sent us to make sure you aren't creating an environmental liability that the bank is going to have to clean up when they foreclose on you next month." "I have a right to inspect the premises," Hauser said, taking a step forward. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. If Hauser saw the MTEG, if he saw the titanium turbine and the high-voltage architecture, he would impound the tractor immediately. The farm would be lost. "No," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. She planted her boots firmly in the dirt. "You do not have a warrant, Hauser. This is private agricultural property. Unless you have a piece of paper signed by a judge, you aren't crossing this threshold." Hauser blinked, intimidated by the sheer ferocity in the exhausted woman's eyes. He looked at Bill, shifting his weight. She's technically right, Mr. Henderson. I can't force entry without a warrant." Bill's face flushed red with anger. He stepped inches from Clara's face. "You're delaying the inevitable. You have no money, no working equipment, and 30 days left. You are dead in the water. I'm going to own this dirt, Clara, and the first thing I'm going to do is bulldoze that barn with your pathetic scrap metal project inside it." "Get off my land, Bill," Clara whispered. Bill spat on the ground near her boots, turned on his heel, and marched back to his pristine truck, Hauser scurrying behind him. Clara watched them drive away, her hands shaking violently. They were out of time. The bank and Henderson were closing in for the kill. She turned back into the barn and locked the door behind her. Greg emerged from the shadows near the back, holding a heavy pipe wrench, his knuckles white. "That was too close," Greg breathed. "They're going to come back with a warrant, Clara. Henderson has the local judge in his pocket. It might take him a few days, but he'll get it." Clara looked at the massive, rusted machine taking up the center of the room. The exterior was a joke, a laughable, rusted relic. But underneath, the beast was fully assembled. "Then we don't have a few days," Clara said, walking over to the tractor and climbing up into the worn, cracked vinyl seat. "We test it tonight, and if it works, we break ground tomorrow." At 2 a.m., the farm was completely silent. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. Clara sat in the cab of the Ford 7000. Greg stood a safe distance away, holding a fire extinguisher, his face pale with tension. There was no key to turn. Instead, Clara flipped a sequence of 3 heavy toggle switches she had mounted on the dash. Click, click, click. A low, deep humming sound began to vibrate through the floorboards. It didn't sound like a tractor. It sounded like an airplane powering up on a tarmac. The magnetic coils of the MTEG began to charge, pulling raw methane from the pressurized auxiliary tank mounted behind the seat. "Pressures are green!" Clara shouted over the rising hum, looking at the digital tablet she had wired into the dashboard. "Turbine spooling!" She pressed the ignition sequence button. Inside the sealed titanium chamber, the methane ignited. The microturbine caught the combustion and began to spin. The sound shifted from a hum to a high-pitched harmonic whine. The massive cast-iron frame of the Ford shuddered violently as the kinetic flywheel engaged, spinning up to 50,000 revolutions per minute in a matter of seconds. The digital display flashed wildly as the electric motors at the rear wheels received their first surge of raw, unadulterated power. "It's holding!" Clara yelled, a manic grin spreading across her face as the voltage meters stabilized perfectly. The engine wasn't just running, it was purring with a terrifying, contained violence. "Put it in gear!" Greg yelled back. Clara grabbed the custom drive lever, held her breath, and pushed it forward. The rusted, engineless, laughing stock of Oakhaven lurched forward with such explosive, instantaneous torque that the massive rear tires ripped a trench into the packed dirt floor of the barn. Clara slammed on the brakes, throwing herself against the steering wheel. The tractor stopped, the turbine whining beautifully beneath the rusted hood. It worked. It actually worked. But as Clara looked up, her smile vanished. Through the crack in the barn door, out in the distance toward the main road, she saw a pair of headlights kill their high beams and pull off onto the shoulder near their property line. Someone was watching them. Someone had heard the turbine. The real war for the Harrison farm was just beginning. The high-pitched whine of the MTEG turbine was still ringing in Clara's ears as she stared through the crack in the barn door. Out on the county road, a quarter-mile away, the headlights that had briefly flicked off suddenly flared back to life. The vehicle's engine roared, a deep, throaty diesel rumble that Clara recognized instantly. It was a heavy-duty truck, and it was tearing away from their property line at a reckless speed, its tires spitting gravel into the humid night air. "Kill the power!" Clara hissed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Greg didn't hesitate. He reached into the rusted cab of the Ford 7000 and slammed the main breaker switch. The massive titanium cylinder beneath the welded hood immediately began its spin-down sequence, the harmonic hum dropping an octave a second until the barn was plunged back into the heavy, suffocating silence of the Iowa summer. "Who was it?" Greg asked, grabbing a heavy tire iron from the workbench. "I couldn't see the plates, but I know the sound of a chipped diesel exhaust," Clara said, her jaw clenched. "It was Brody, Bill Henderson's foreman." Greg ran a hand through his thinning, sweat-soaked hair. If Brody was watching, that means Henderson knows we're up to something. "They heard the turbine, Clara. You can't disguise that sound. It doesn't sound like a farm tractor. It sounds like a commercial jet preparing for takeoff." "Let them hear it," Clara said, stepping away from the door and looking back at the rusted beast resting in the center of the dirt floor. "Hearing it and understanding it are two very different things, but we've lost the element of surprise. They know the tractor runs." "So what's the play?" Greg asked. Clara walked over to a battered map of their property pinned to the barn wall. She traced her finger over a large, red outlined section at the top edge of the paper. "The North 40, Clara said softly. Greg stepped back, shaking his head. "Clara, no, that field is a graveyard. It's pure, compacted clay. With this drought, that dirt has baked into solid concrete. It's what cracked the block on the John Deere. You put a plow into that ground right now, it'll snap the shanks right off the frame. We don't have a choice, Clara countered, her voice hardening with resolve. Sterling and Henderson are trying to bleed us dry by running out the clock. If we can't plant a late-season cash crop, that new fast-yield winter wheat hybrid, we miss the harvest window. If we miss the window, we don't have the $74,000 for the bank by October. The North 40 is our largest contiguous acreage. We have to break that soil. A standard tractor needs at least 400 horsepower just to scratch the surface of that clay, Greg warned, looking nervously at the rusted Ford. You're talking about hooking up the deep ripper plow. That implement weighs 3 tons. Clara patted the cold, bruised steel of the Ford's fender. Grandpa Thomas engineered the MTEG to produce the electrical equivalent of 600 horsepower, with 100% of the torque available at 0 revolutions per minute. No gears to slip, no transmission to overheat, just pure, unadulterated kinetic force. She looked Greg in the eye, the fire of desperation burning brightly. Tomorrow morning, we don't hide anymore. Tomorrow, we drag the deep ripper out to the North 40 in broad daylight. We are going to rip that field wide open, and we are going to do it right in front of Bill Henderson. The rest of the night was a blur of frantic, exhausted preparation. They checked every high-pressure methane seal, tightened every motor mount, and greased the heavy linkage of the massive 12-shank deep ripper plow that had been sitting unused in the weeds for 2 years. By the time the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, painting the Iowa sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the trap was set. But out by the methane lagoon, hidden in the tall switchgrass, a fresh set of heavy boot prints had pressed deep into the mud, leading directly toward the buried PVC gas line. The saboteur hadn't just been watching from the road. News in a dying farm town travels faster than a prairie fire. By 8 a.m., the gravel shoulder of County Road 9, running alongside the Harrisons' North 40, was lined with pickup trucks. Word had leaked from Brody to the regulars at the local diner that Crazy Clara was finally going to attempt to farm with the gutted scrap metal she bought at the auction. Farmers, dealing with their own drought-stricken crops, leaned against the hoods of their trucks, holding thermoses of coffee. There was a mix of genuine pity and morbid curiosity in the air. At the center of the crowd stood Bill Henderson, flanked by Brody and a few other corporate farm hands. Bill was wearing his signature spotless Stetson, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. I give it 10 feet, Bill announced loudly to the men around him, making sure his voice carried over the morning breeze. 10 feet before that rusted piece of junk snaps an axle, or she bursts a blood vessel trying to peddle it. That clay is rock solid. Should we call a tow truck now, boss? Brody chuckled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Nah, let her humiliate herself, Bill smirked. Sterling has the foreclosure papers drafted. Once she realizes she can't even scratch the dirt, she'll sign the land over willingly, just to end the embarrassment. A sudden, strange sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd. It wasn't the heavy, percussive chug-chug-chug of a massive diesel engine. It was a smooth, escalating whine, like a massive industrial fan winding up to maximum speed. Heads turned toward the Harrisons' farm lane. Rolling out from behind the tree line was the 1978 Ford 7000. It looked utterly pathetic in the harsh morning sunlight. The paint was a bruised, flaky brown. The cab lacked doors or glass, but the way it moved was entirely unnatural. It didn't bounce or struggle. It glided forward with a terrifying, smooth momentum, towing the massive 3-ton deep ripper plow behind it as if it were a child's red wagon. Clara sat in the open cab, wearing her grandfather's old leather aviator goggles to protect her eyes from the dust, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She pulled the rig parallel to the fence line, stopping right in front of where Bill Henderson and the crowd were gathered. The strange, high-pitched whine of the enclosed turbine was deafening now. The farmers at the fence frowned in confusion. There was no black smoke pouring from an exhaust stack. There was no smell of diesel. What the hell is that noise? Brody muttered, stepping back from the fence line, unnerved. Sounds like a damn UFO. It's a parlor trick, Bill yelled over the noise, though his confident smirk had slipped slightly. She's got a generator rigged up in there. Hey, Clara, he shouted, stepping up to the barbed wire. You ready to admit defeat and sell? Or are you going to break your toys first? Clara didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. She reached down to the hydraulic levers and slammed them forward. Behind the tractor, the heavy hydraulic cylinders hissed, and the 12 massive steel shanks of the deep ripper plunged down into the sun-baked, concrete-hard clay. The entire tractor violently jerked downward as the heavy iron teeth bit into the unforgiving earth. The crowd went dead silent. This was the moment. This was where the engine would stall, where a normal transmission would scream and strip its gears under the impossible load. Clara took a deep breath, gripped the steering wheel, and pushed the custom electric drive lever all the way forward. Inside the rusted shell, the MTEG unleashed hell. The turbine fed a massive surge of raw voltage to the heavy-duty electric motors mounted on the rear axle. There was no hesitation, no building of RPMs. Crack! A sound like a cannon firing echoed across the field as the solid crust of the earth shattered. The rusted Ford 7000 surged forward. The massive rear tires, heavily ballasted with liquid, dug into the dirt and gripped. The tractor didn't just pull the plow, it dragged it through the baked clay at a blistering 12 miles per hour. Massive, dry boulders of soil were ripped from the earth and thrown into the air, churning like a violent brown ocean behind the machine. The sheer, terrifying torque of the electric drive system ripped through the compacted ground as if it were soft butter. The tractor didn't stall. The whine of the turbine remained perfectly, eerily constant, effortlessly maintaining the immense power output. At the fence line, coffee thermoses dropped onto the gravel. Jaws hung open. Bill Henderson stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. He watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as Clara Harrison easily carved a deep, perfect, 6-foot-wide trench through the hardest soil in the county, tearing up the length of the field at a speed no traditional tractor could ever achieve under that kind of load. That's impossible," an older farmer whispered, gripping the barbed wire. "There ain't a diesel engine on earth that size that can pull a 12-bottom ripper through that clay." Clara reached the end of the field, executed a flawless tight turn, dropped the plow again, and came tearing back down the next row. The ground shook beneath the spectators' boots. She locked eyes with Bill Henderson as she flew past him, throwing a massive wave of shattered dirt against the fence line, coating his spotless boots and expensive truck in a thick layer of Iowa dust. She didn't smile, she just kept plowing. By the time Clara finished the 50-acre field, a job that should have taken 2 days of grueling, fuel-heavy labor, only 4 hours had passed. She hadn't spent a single dime on diesel. The MTEG had run purely on the methane captured from their own waste lagoon. When she finally killed the power near the barn, the silence that fell over the farm was triumphant. Greg ran out to meet her, his face split into a massive, disbelieving grin. "You did it!" he shouted, pulling her down from the cab and spinning her in a circle. "Clara, it didn't even overheat. The temperature gauges stayed completely in the green." But as Clara looked back toward the road, the crowd was gone. Bill Henderson's truck was gone. "We won the battle, Greg," Clara said, her breathing heavy, wiping grease and dirt from her forehead. "But we just forced their hand. Henderson isn't going to laugh at us anymore. He's going to try and destroy us." The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. The viral rumors of the magic tractor had reached the polished mahogany desk of Richard Sterling at First Continental Bank before noon. Sterling was a man who detested variables. He dealt in ledgers, risk assessments, and guaranteed returns. Clara Harrison paying off her loan was not the return he wanted. He had already promised the land to the corporate conglomerate backing Bill Henderson. At 3 p.m., a Blacktown car pulled into the Harrison driveway. Sterling stepped out, adjusting his silk tie, followed closely by Bill Henderson and Inspector Hauser. Clara and Greg met them on the front porch, the sweat from the morning's miraculous harvest still drying on their clothes. "Mrs. Harrison," Sterling began, his voice slick and devoid of emotion. "I'll get right to the point. We've received multiple reports of unregulated, hazardous equipment being operated on a property financed by First Continental. As per Section 4, Clause 8 of your mortgage agreement, the operation of uninsurable, experimental machinery on collateralized land is a direct violation of your loan terms." Clara crossed her arms, her knuckles white. "It's a tractor, Richard. It plows dirt. It is a liability," Sterling countered smoothly. "Inspector Hauser here has a court order, signed an hour ago by Judge Davies. He is here to tag the machine. You are forbidden from operating it, moving it, or utilizing it for agricultural purposes until a full structural and environmental engineering study can be completed. A study that will take 6 months, Bill Henderson chimed in, stepping out from behind the banker, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. And your payment is due in 3 weeks. You can't plant the wheat without the tractor, Clara. You're done. You can't do this, Greg yelled, stepping off the porch. That machine is safe. It's safer than any diesel burner you have in your corporate fleets. Then you won't mind the inspection, Hauser squeaked, holding up a bright red tag attached to a zip tie. I need to affix this to the steering column. Clara felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. If Hauser got close enough to pop the welded hood, if he saw the aerospace titanium, the magnetic coils, the MTEG, they wouldn't just confiscate the tractor. They would confiscate her grandfather's life's work. They would steal the patent. It was the ultimate corporate theft, disguised as a safety protocol. Fine, Clara said, her voice eerily calm. Tag it. It's in the barn. Greg looked at her in shock, but Clara subtly shook her head, silencing him. Hauser scurried over to the barn, escorted by Henderson. Clara watched as the inspector nervously attached the red plastic tag to the steering wheel of the rusted Ford. Do not break that seal, Clara, Henderson warned, tapping the plastic tag. It's a federal offense. We'll have a flatbed here on Monday to impound it for the safety study. The 3 men climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, leaving Clara and Greg standing in the dust. Are you out of your mind? Greg exploded as soon as the cars were out of sight. Monday! They're going to steal it, Clara. They're going to open the hood and take the MTEG. I know, Clara said, staring at the red tag glowing ominously in the shadows of the barn, which is why it won't be here on Monday. What are you talking about? We proved it works in the dirt, Clara said, walking over to the tractor and running her hand along the cold steel. But plowing the North 40 doesn't pay the bank. We need $74,000 in cash before Monday. That's impossible, Greg said, his voice breaking. We have nothing to sell. Yes, we do, Clara said, turning to face him, her eyes locking onto a worn poster stapled to the barn wall. It was an advertisement for the upcoming Tri-State Heavy Implement Pull, the largest tractor-pulling competition in the Midwest, happening that Saturday night at the county fairgrounds. The prize for the unlimited modified class, a class dominated by million-dollar, multi-engine, corporate-sponsored machines, was exactly $75,000. Clara, Greg whispered, following her gaze to the poster. Those are professional pulling tractors. They run on aviation fuel and have 3 engines chained together. They put out 2,000 horsepower. This is an experimental farm engine. It's a kinetic flywheel electromagnetic drive, Clara corrected him, a dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. Grandpa Thomas said it produces the equivalent of 600 horsepower for farming, but he also left a notebook on how to bypass the safety governors on the turbine. If we open the intake valves and flood the chamber with pure, highly pressurized methane, the turbine could rip itself apart, Greg said, terrified. The chassis could snap in half. Or, Clara said, stepping up to the tractor and violently ripping the red inspection tag off the steering wheel, throwing it into the dirt. We unleash everything this machine has, humiliate the corporate teams on live television, take their prize money, and pay off the bank in cash on Monday morning. Greg stared at the torn red tag in the dirt, and then up at his wife. The fear in his chest was slowly being replaced by a massive, adrenaline-fueled surge of rebellion. We're going to need a bigger roll cage, Greg said. That night, as the Harrisons began stripping the Ford 7000 down to its bare necessary weight, preparing to turn a farm implement into a competitive monster, the shadows outside the barn shifted. Brody stepped out from the tree line, holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters and a map of the farm's underground pipe system. He hadn't left with Henderson. He had stayed behind, and he had found the buried methane line that fueled the beast. The heavy iron bolt cutters in Brody's hands gleamed under the pale moonlight as he knelt in the damp switchgrass behind the Harrisons' barn. He had spent hours tracking the subtle depression in the soil that marked the buried PVC pipe. He didn't know what kind of gas was flowing through it, but he knew what made a farm run. If he cut the fuel, he cut the heart. Brody clamped the jaws of the cutters around the thick Schedule 40 pipe. With a grunt of effort, he squeezed the handles together. The plastic cracked and then shattered. Instantly, a violent hiss of pressurized gas erupted into the night air. The smell of concentrated, unrefined methane hit Brody's nostrils, making his eyes water. He coughed, stumbling backward as the invisible geyser vented the farm's entire fuel supply into the atmosphere. He smiled grimly, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and slipped away into the darkness. Saturday morning dawned with a suffocating, breathless heat. The air was thick with humidity, settling over the farm like a wet wool blanket. Clara and Greg had slept a combined total of 3 hours, having spent the night fabricating a crude but robust roll cage out of heavy-gauge steel piping they had salvaged from an old cattle corral. "We need to pressurize the primary tank," Clara said, wiping a streak of black grease from her cheek as she stepped back to admire their handiwork. The Ford 7000 looked entirely different now. It was stripped of its fenders, its cab roof, and every ounce of unnecessary metal. It was nothing but a heavy iron skeleton, thick tractor tires, and the welded hood concealing the aerospace secret within. Greg nodded, walking to the back of the barn to hit the main breaker for the compressor. He flipped the switch. Nothing happened. There was no deep hum of the electric motor, no rhythmic thud of the pistons pulling methane from the lagoon. "Clara," Greg's voice dropped, carrying a terrible, hollow weight. "The compressor is dead. The pressure gauge on the holding tank, it's at 0. Clara sprinted to the back of the barn. She tapped the glass face of the pressure dial. The needle didn't flinch. She dropped to her knees, tracing the rubber intake hose out beneath the barn wall. She scrambled outside, following the disturbed dirt path toward the lagoon. When she reached the patch of crushed switchgrass, the smell of lingering methane was undeniable. She saw the shattered, jagged ends of the PVC pipe. "Brody," Clara whispered, her fists clenching so tightly her fingernails dug painfully into her palms. Greg jogged up behind her, taking in the scene. The color drained from his face. "The tank is empty. The line is completely severed. The compressor motor must have burned itself out trying to pump air from a broken vacuum. We have no fuel, Clara. The MTEG runs on that specific gas density. We're done." It was 8 a.m. Weigh-in for the tri-state heavy implement pull was at 4 p.m. Clara stood up, staring at the shattered pipe. A strange, eerie calm washed over her. It was the calm of a cornered animal, realizing it had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Grandpa Thomas built the turbine to run on raw biogas because it was free," Clara said, her mind racing, mentally flipping through the pages of her grandfather's frantic, handwritten engineering journals. "But the combustion chamber is titanium. The injectors are variable. It doesn't strictly need methane. It just needs a highly combustible, pressurized vapor that burns hot enough to spool the kinetic flywheel." "Where are we going to get pressurized gas on a Saturday morning?" Greg asked frantically. "Propane? The co-op won't sell to us. Henderson put a freeze on our credit account." "Not propane," Clara said. "The burn rate is too slow. It won't spin the turbine fast enough to generate the voltage we need for a sled pull. We need something volatile, something that burns incredibly fast and incredibly hot." She looked at Greg. "Ethanol. Pure, unadulterated alcohol." Greg stared at her. "Clara, this isn't a race car. And even if it was, where are we getting 100 gallons of pure ethanol in 6 hours? We aren't going to a gas station," Clara said, turning on her heel and jogging back toward the rusted farm truck. "We're going to see Caleb Whitman." Caleb Doc Whitman lived at the absolute edge of the county line, deep in a heavily wooded hollow that most folks pretended didn't exist. He was a retired industrial chemist who had traded his corporate pension for a life of aggressive solitude. Officially, he ran a small artisan distillery, making legal, small-batch bourbon. Unofficially, Caleb produced the highest-proof, eye-watering grain alcohol in the Midwest, a volatile liquid mostly used by local drag racers who needed cheap, high-octane fuel for their modified engines. When Clara's truck slid into Caleb's gravel driveway, the old man was sitting on his porch, a shotgun resting casually across his lap, a massive hound dog asleep at his feet. "You're a long way from prime topsoil, Clara Harrison," Caleb rasped, not moving an inch as she stepped out of the truck. "Heard you've been having some trouble with the bank." "I need fuel, Caleb," Clara said, walking straight up to the porch, ignoring the shotgun. "I need your special reserve. 100 gallons. The clear stuff. The stuff that eats through plastic." Caleb's eyebrows shot up. "You drink 100 gallons of that? You'll go blind and catch fire simultaneously. What in God's name do you need that for?" "I'm putting it in a tractor." Caleb stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then a slow, gravelly laugh erupted from his chest. "I heard the rumors about you out there, plowing the North 40 with a dead machine. You building a bomb, girl?" "I'm building a way out of debt," Clara replied, her voice dead serious. "I don't have the money to pay you today, but if you give me the fuel, I will pay you triple your asking price tomorrow morning. If I lose, the bank takes my farm, and you can come take my truck as collateral." Caleb looked at the desperate, unyielding fire in Clara's eyes. He stood up, breaking the shotgun open to clear the chamber. "Back your truck around to the shed. I got 2 50-gallon steel drums. But I'm warning you, Clara, you put this in a standard combustion engine, it's gonna melt the pistons right out of the block." "It's a good thing I don't have pistons then," Clara said. They spent the next 4 hours engaged in a terrifying mechanical triage. Hooking the MTEG up to a liquid ethanol drip required reprogramming the electronic control module. Clara had to completely rewrite the fuel-to-air ratio algorithms her grandfather had meticulously coded. The danger of thermal runaway was extreme. If the ethanol burned too hot, the titanium turbine wouldn't just overheat, the magnetic coils surrounding it would melt, causing the 70,000 RPM flywheel to shatter like a glass bomb inside the cast-iron chassis. At 3:15 p.m., Greg finished strapping the 2 heavy steel drums of Old Man Whitman's moonshine to the rear axle of the Ford, directly behind the roll cage. They ran braided steel aircraft hoses from the drums into the high-pressure injection manifold. "We can't test it," Clara said, throwing her welding mask onto the workbench. "If we fire it up now, we risk blowing the seals before we even get to the track. We have to do it live." Greg backed their borrowed heavy-duty flatbed trailer into the barn. Using a heavy winch, they dragged the silent, dead-looking Ford 7000 up the ramps. They threw a massive gray canvas tarp over it, strapping it down tight. "Let's go steal $75,000, Clara said. The Oak Haven County Fairgrounds smelled of fried dough, spilled beer, and the thick, acrid stench of burnt diesel fuel. The grandstands were packed with 5,000 screaming fans. Under the blazing stadium lights, the dirt track stretched out for exactly 320 feet, a heavily compacted strip of clay that was about to be punished. Tractor pulling is the world's heaviest motorsport. A modified tractor hooks up to a mechanical sled. As the tractor pulls, a massive weight box mechanically slides forward, transferring thousands of pounds of pressure downward, driving a heavy metal pan into the dirt. What starts as a heavy load quickly becomes an immovable anchor. The goal is a full pull, dragging the sled the entire length of the track. Clara and Greg pulled their truck into the pit area, immediately dwarfed by the multi-million-dollar rigs surrounding them. These machines bore no resemblance to farm equipment. They boasted massive, specialized tires, elongated frames, and multiple engines chained together. As Clara stepped out, she spotted him immediately. Brody was leaning against an aggressive matte black machine with neon green accents, the Earthshaker, sponsored by Titan AgriCorp. It featured 3 supercharged V8 engines stacked sequentially. Brody, wearing a custom fire suit, was laughing with Bill Henderson. Clara marched straight to the registration tent. The head official, Dennis Riggins, looked over his clipboard. "I'm here for the unlimited modified class," Clara said, slapping her entry fee onto the folding table. Dennis looked past her to the tarp-covered lump on the flatbed. He chuckled. "Mrs. Harrison, Richard Sterling mentioned you might try something desperate. Roll it off the scales. Let's see the joke." Greg pulled the tarp away. Laughter rippled through the pit area. The mechanics pointed at the rusted, bruised chassis of the 1978 Ford 7000. It looked like a junkyard relic wrapped in a crude roll cage. "No exhaust stacks, no visible intake. You missing an engine block, Clara?" Dennis tapped his pen against the clipboard. "The power plant is enclosed," Clara replied smoothly. "Rule 4, Section B states the engine configuration is open, provided the vehicle does not exceed the 8,000-pound limit and power goes to the rear wheels. Weigh it." The track crew pushed the Ford onto the digital scales. The bright red numbers settled at 7,850 pounds. "Weight is legal," Dennis grumbled, eyeing the heavy steel drums strapped to the back. "What's the fuel?" "Liquid combustible," Clara stated. "Not regulated in the unlimited class," Dennis scribbled on his paperwork. "Fine, you're in. But when that scrap snaps in half on the starting line, you're paying the toll fee. Clara walked back to the tractor. Greg was pacing, his nerves completely frayed. Clara, Brody's running 3 supercharged engines. That's pushing almost 3,000 horsepower. We have a 600 horsepower turbine in a rusted shell. Horsepower is just a calculation of work over time, Clara said, climbing into the cramped roll cage and fastening the 5-point racing harness. Tractor pulling is about pure torque. Those V8s have to spin at 8,000 RPMs and push through a gearbox. I have a direct drive electromagnetic field. I don't have gears. I have instantaneous kinetic violence. Let Brody think he's going to bury us. The competition began. Massive plumes of thick black diesel smoke blotted out the stadium lights. Tractors screamed, fighting the crushing weight of the sled. Parts snapped and engines blew. Then, the announcer's voice boomed over the PA system. Next up, the reigning champion, sponsored by Titan AgriCorp, Brody Jenkins, driving the Earth Shaker. The crowd erupted. Brody fired up the V8s, the ground vibrating violently. The green flag dropped. The Earthshaker launched, the front end shooting into the air. The engines screamed as the sled's weight box crept forward. At 200 feet, the weight hit the pan. The engines bogged down under the unbearable load. But Brody pushed it until the rig finally stalled in a massive cloud of black smoke. A spectacular run! 312 feet, the announcer screamed. Brody climbed out, raising his arms. He found Clara in the pits and drew a finger across his throat. Up in the VIP box, Sterling and Henderson clinked glasses. The $75,000 was practically theirs. And now, our final entry. The announcer sounded confused. Folks, we have an independent entry. Clara Harrison driving a 1978 Ford chassis. It appears to be missing an engine. Let's give her a hand for bravery. Pitying applause echoed through the stadium. Greg towed the Ford to the starting line. Clara sat in the roll cage, staring at the digital tablet, zip-tied to the steering column. The track officials hooked the heavy chain to her rear hitch. Fire it up, lady! The flagman yelled skeptically. Clara flipped 3 heavy toggle switches. Click, click, click. The magnetic coils charged. Clara hit the ignition. There was no roar or smoke. Instead, a terrifying, high-pitched whine built beneath the rusted hood, sounding like a massive jet engine spooling up. The pitch vibrated in the chests of the front row. The crowd's laughter died instantly. Pressure's at maximum, Clara whispered, watching the titanium combustion chamber temperature climb. The turbine was spinning at 90,000 RPMs. The rusted chassis shook violently. The flagman, unnerved by the unearthly sound, waved the green flag and ran backward. Clara slammed the custom electric drive lever all the way forward. The response was apocalyptic. There was no delay, no building of RPMs, no clutch slip. The instant connection of the electromagnetic drive dumped the equivalent of 1,000 foot-pounds of raw torque directly into the locked rear differential. The massive, heavily ballasted rear tires of the Ford bit into the clay. The heavy iron front axle slammed violently into the air, hovering 3 feet off the ground. The tractor didn't just pull the sled, it snapped the heavy chain taut with the force of a bomb blast and launched forward. In the grandstands, thousands of people gasped. A rusted, engineless farm tractor was tearing down the track at twice the speed of the Earthshaker. Inside the roll cage, Clara was thrown back against her seat, her teeth rattling from the violent G-force. The whine of the turbine was deafening. 100 feet, the sled's weight box began to slide forward. The resistance increased exponentially, but the MTEG didn't care. It had no gears to bog down. The kinetic flywheel, fueled by Caleb's volatile moonshine, simply demanded more electricity, forcing the electric motors to turn with relentless, brutal efficiency. 200 feet. The weight box slammed into the front of the sled. The heavy metal pan dropped, driving thousands of pounds of pressure straight into the compacted clay. This was the wall. This was where the V8s had died. The Ford shuddered. The speed dropped, but the rear tires never stopped turning. They dug massive trenches into the earth, throwing rooster tails of dirt 50 feet into the air. Clara looked at the tablet. The titanium combustion chamber temperature had spiked into the deep red. Warning, thermal overload, core temperature 1,400 degrees. Smoke began to pour out from under the welded hood. Not exhaust smoke, but the paint on the metal blistering and vaporizing from the sheer heat radiating off the turbine. 280 feet. The tractor was crawling now. The strain on the chassis was immense. The sound of bending metal shrieked over the whine of the engine. "Come on, Grandpa!" Clara screamed, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles bone white. "Hold together! Just hold together!" She reached over and bypassed the safety governor, dumping the last reserve of pure ethanol directly into the combustion chamber. The turbine screamed. A jet of blue flame shot out from the side panels. The tractor surged one final violent time. 300 feet, 312 feet. She passed Brody's marker. 320 feet. The Ford tore across the finish line, dragging the massive sled completely off the track. Clara slammed the breaker switch, killing the power. The fuel flow stopped. The massive turbine spun down with a dying, harmonic wail. Complete silence washed over the fairgrounds, save for the hissing of steam pouring from beneath the rusted hood of the Ford 7000. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then the electronic scoreboard flashed in bright neon green. Distance, 325 feet. Full pull. New track record. The grandstands erupted into absolute bedlam. 5,000 people were screaming, throwing hats into the air. Mechanics from corporate teams ran to the fence line, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Clara unbuckled her harness, her hands shaking violently. She pushed herself out of the roll cage and dropped to the dirt, her legs completely numb. Greg was already sprinting down the track, tears streaming down his face. He tackled her into a massive, dirt-covered hug. "You did it! You broke the record!" Greg yelled over the screaming crowd. Clara looked back at the starting line. Brody was standing motionless, staring at the dirt. Up in the VIP box, Bill Henderson had crushed his plastic beer cup in his hand, his face purple with rage. Richard Sterling looked as though he had seen a ghost. They had won. The $75,000 prize was theirs. Monday morning brought a crisp, clear autumn breeze. At exactly 9 a.m., Richard Sterling's Blacktown car pulled into the Harrison driveway. Sterling stepped out, clutching a leather briefcase containing the foreclosure documents. Bill Henderson was right behind him, looking tired and uncharacteristically quiet. Clara was waiting for them on the porch, sipping a cup of black coffee. "Morning, Richard." "Bill," Clara said brightly. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Mrs. Harrison, I assume you received the notice on Friday regarding the violation of your loan terms? The equipment seizure is—" Clara didn't let him finish. She reached down into a heavy canvas duffel bag sitting by her rocking chair. She pulled out a massive, banded stack of crisp $100 bills. She tossed it casually off the porch. It landed directly at Sterling's polished shoes with a heavy thud. $74,000, Richard, Clara said, taking a sip of her coffee. "In cash. Plus a little extra for the late fee. The mortgage is paid. The farm is mine." Sterling stared at the money, his jaw tight. He looked at Henderson, who refused to meet his eye. Slowly, agonizingly, Sterling knelt down, picked up the cash, and placed it in his briefcase. "This isn't over, Clara," Henderson sneered, finally speaking up. "Whatever voodoo you built in that tractor, the world is going to want it. And the big boys, the real corporations, they'll crush you to take it. Let them try," Clara smiled, her eyes cold and sharp. "I've got the patent papers filed. Grandpa Thomas's design is registered to me, and if they want to fight, they know where to find me." Henderson scoffed, turned around, and walked back to his truck. Sterling silently followed. Clara watched them drive away, the dust settling on the driveway. She walked back out to the barn. The rusted Ford 7000 sat quietly in the center of the room. The hood was heavily scorched, the paint completely burned away, leaving raw, blackened steel. It looked terrifying. It looked beautiful. It was no longer just a piece of scrap metal. It was a revolution born in the dirt, fueled by necessity, and built by a farmer who refused to be broken. Clara Harrison didn't just save her family's legacy that night. She ignited a spark that would eventually force the entire agricultural industry to rethink the future of power. Her grandfather's hidden genius, paired with her relentless grit, proved that the most extraordinary innovations often hide beneath the most broken, rusted exteriors. The MTEG engine remains a legendary tale of underdog engineering, a testament to what happens when you corner someone who who has nothing left to lose. What did you think of Clara's incredible high-voltage gamble? Would you have had the courage to ride a ticking, ethanol-fueled time bomb down the dirt track to save your home? Let us know in the comments below. If you love this deep dive into real-life mechanical drama and underdog triumph, be sure to hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling tales.